Across the waves came the sea peoples, leaving the Bronze Age in ruins. Welcome to Echo Slumber. I am your host. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let's begin. In the dim light of memory, there are moments in history when whole civilizations seem to sigh and then fall silent. 3,000 years ago, the shores of the eastern Mediterranean trembled as strange fleets appeared on the horizon. Warriors and wanderers we now call the sea peoples. Their names, if they had them, are carried only on the wind, their purpose shrouded in the mists of time. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in weeks, and the great powers of the Bronze Age, Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae, found themselves in ruin. Tonight, we will drift along those ancient waves, tracing the whispers of forgotten oars and unanswered questions. Because here, in the quiet, history is not a list of dates, but a tide you can feel beneath your feet. And remember, in this space, we truly care about you, the listener, and the gentle journey we take together. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. The 13th century BCE was an age that seemed to breathe in rhythm with the sea. From the sun-struck palaces of Mycenae to the bustling harbours of the Nile Delta, the Mediterranean shimmered with the energy of connection. A vast and intricate web spun from bronze ambition and the fragile trust between kings. Great roads wound through Anatolia, bearing tribute and messages sealed in clay. Markets rang with the sound of copper ingots sliding onto carts, jars of wine being unstoppered, and the murmur of merchants haggling over wool, olive oil, and spices from far-off coasts. This was a world at its height, the culmination of centuries of human ingenuity. Yet if one leaned close and listened, there was a different sound beneath the music, a faint creaking as though the beams of this grand structure were under strain. The palaces of the Mycenaean lords stood proud on their citadels, their walls thick and confident, painted with scenes of chariots and warriors. Their storerooms overflowed with amphorae of oil and grain, and their scribes kept careful tallies in the strange blocky script we now call linear. Across the eastern horizon, the Hittite Empire, with its fortress cities and vast bureaucracy, commanded respect and fear alike. Their clay tablets recorded treaties with Egypt, lists of vassal kings, and inventories of grain reserves, all in a tone that assumed permanence. And Egypt, the eternal kingdom along the Nile, stood like a sentinel, its temples glowing with gold leaf, its armies seasoned by centuries of victory. To live in this age was to believe, perhaps, that such greatness could not fade. But nature has its own cycles, and the earth beneath these empires was whispering a warning. Seasons grew unpredictable. In some years, the rains failed, leaving fields brittle and dry. In others, storms came too heavy, washing away the harvest. Farmers in Anatolia and the Levant grumbled about soil that no longer yielded, as it once had. Famine was not yet a spectre stalking the streets, but it had begun to haunt the edges of the collective mind. Even in Egypt, where the Nile's floods were more reliable than most rulers, priests made offerings to ensure the river would rise again. Trade, the lifeblood of this age, also carried its own fragility. Bronze required both copper and tin, metals often sourced from far-flung lands. One disrupted shipment, one severed alliance, could ripple outward like a stone thrown into still water. The merchants of Ugarit, the Levant's glittering port city, still sent their ships to Cyprus and Crete, but they began to speak in quieter tones about piracy, about strange sails glimpsed on the horizon. The routes that had seemed eternal were in truth threads pulled taut over a growing void. In the courts of kings, diplomacy grew more brittle. The very network of gift-giving and mutual defence that had once tied the great powers together began to tangle with mistrust. Envoys arrived with smiles and heavy chests of gold, but behind their eyes was calculation, the weighing of allies against potential threats. The Hittites had their hands full keeping rebellious vassals in line. Mycenaean kings squabbled among themselves, their unity more fragile than the stone walls that encircled them. Egypt's pharaohs looked northward toward Anatolia and Syria with wary eyes, remembering past wars and uneasy treaties. The people themselves, the farmers, sailors, artisans and shepherds, could not have known they stood at the edge of an era's collapse. For them, life was a daily rhythm, tending sheep under a blazing sun, unloading goods in a harbour's dawn mist, singing to children by the hearth. But in retrospect, the signs were there. The last generation to grow up in the full light of the Bronze Age was already carrying the seeds of a different world, though they could not yet see it. There was perhaps a stillness to these final years, a deceptive calm like the heavy air before a storm breaks. In the carved corridors of palaces, flickering torchlight still played over scenes of triumph. In the sanctuaries of gods, incense still curled upward in lazy spirals. Yet in the creak of a ship's timbers, in the cautious glances exchanged by merchants, in the silent prayers of a farmer watching the sky, something was shifting. A great change was coming, though no one could have said from where, and so the Bronze Age stood, luminous and vulnerable, its power built on the delicate balance of trade, alliance, and the will of the earth itself. It would not collapse in a single blow, but in a slow unravelling, tugged loose by forces both human and natural. Soon the oars of strangers would cut through these waters. The smoke of burning cities would stain. The horizon and the web that had held this world together would come undone. But for now, in these last calm breaths, the Mediterranean still gleamed under the sun, unaware that its golden age was already slipping into history's tide. The markets of Ugarit stirred to life with the first light of dawn, the salty breath of the sea mingling with the smell of warm bread and crushed herbs. Merchants called out in a dozen tongues, their stalls heavy with copper ingots from Cyprus, jars of olive oil from Crete, and fine linen woven along the Nile. Here the Mediterranean was not just a body of water, but a living thread, binding far-flung lands into a single, intricate tapestry. The clink of scales weighed more than goods. It measured trust, connection, and the fragile peace that made such commerce possible. From the harbour side, where sailors shouted as they unloaded amphorae and coiled ropes, one could follow narrow streets into the heart of the city. There scribes sat cross-legged with clay tablets, their styluses moving with practiced ease. They recorded contracts, shipments, and letters to foreign kings, each impression pressed into the clay, a small act of order in a world that relied on balance. Temples rose above the bustle, their steps crowded with supplicants, bringing figs, honey, and small bronze figurines to appease the gods of sea and storm, guardians of the trade routes on which Ugarit's wealth depended. Far across the wine-dark sea, the palaces of Mycenae stood like crowns upon rocky hills, their cyclopean walls glinting in the sunlight. Behind those walls, the courts echoed with the sound of sandal on stone, as envoys came bearing gifts, worked ivory, exotic animals, and weapons inlaid with gold. In the great megaron beneath painted ceilings of spiralling rosettes, rulers presided over feasts where wine flowed from massive craters, and singers wove the deeds of heroes into the air. The Mycenaean kings were not content to remain within their walls. Their ships sailed far and wide, bringing back stories and silver, forging alliances with feasts as much as with swords. Thebes, the jewel of Egypt's Upper Nile, moved to a rhythm older than memory. The broad steps of its temples bore the weight of priests in spotless linen, carrying offerings past towering pylons carved with scenes of gods in eternal triumph. In the shade of columned halls, artisans worked gold into diadems, painted delicate lotus flowers on pottery, and inscribed prayers into papyrus scrolls. Barges drifted along the river, their decks piled high with grain, papyrus, and the precious blue stone of lapis lazuli from lands beyond the horizon. The Nile's steady pulse kept Egypt's heart beating, but even here, In this kingdom of seeming eternity, the currents of change were stirring far upstream. The prosperity of the late Bronze Age was as much an art form as it was an economy. It was a choreography of ships and caravans, of treaties sealed with gifts, of craftsmen whose hands transformed raw materials into marvels. Copper from Cyprus met tin from as far away as the mountains of Central Asia, combining into bronze, the metal that armed soldiers, ploughed fields, and shaped the tools of daily life. Without these connections, the empires would wither. Everyone knew this, though few could imagine a world without the steady arrival of ships in the harbour. And yet, beneath the painted facades and bustling markets, there were small tremors in the dance, a missed shipment here, an insult buried in the flowery language of a royal letter there. In Ugarit, merchants whispered about piracy in the straits. In Mycenae, the price of tin crept higher with each season, the metal arriving later than expected. Even in Egypt, where Pharaoh's word was law, the scribes had begun to record prayers for the calming of the foreign lands. These were not yet alarms, only dissonant notes in the music, a rhythm that seemed, to those attuned, to be playing just a little too fast. The artists of the age, unknowingly, were preserving a world on the brink. Frescoes in palaces showed ships gliding across calm seas, warriors in ordered ranks, harvests overflowing. Clay tablets detailed shipments with an almost obsessive precision, as though to write something down was to make it eternal. But in the stillness between brushstrokes and chisel strikes, the world was shifting. A single disruption, a storm sinking a ship, a rebellion in a vassal state, a change in the wind that delayed a convoy could ripple outward, tugging at the fine threads that held this great tapestry together. The Bronze Age was beautiful in its balance, but beauty built on tension is like a lyre string tuned too tightly. It can sing, but it can also snap. And somewhere, perhaps already, on a horizon not yet seen, sails were forming against the light, their shadows long upon the waves. The music played on, bright and full, but the next movement would not be as the composers intended. They came first as shapes against the horizon, small at first like the silhouettes of seabirds, until the wind filled their sails and the sun caught on bronze. The ships were unlike the merchant vessels that made the harbours of Ugarit, Byblos and Cyprus so familiar. These hulls were long and lean, built for speed and manoeuvre rather than the weight of cargo. Their prows rose high, some carved into the fierce curves of beasts, as though the ships themselves were alive and hungry. And from their decks came the flash of metal, shields, helmets, spearheads, each one catching the light like a flare before a storm. No one knew for certain where they had come from. The letters found in ruined cities speak only of those who come from the sea, as if the very ocean had birthed them in anger. Whispers travelled faster than their oars, of distant islands beyond the familiar trade routes, of lands swallowed by famine or fire, forcing their people into exile. Some said they came from the far west, from the shadowed edges of the known world, bringing with them the salt and wind of places no scribe had ever named. Others claimed they were fragments of many peoples, woven together by desperation into a single moving tide. When the sea peoples appeared, they did not come like ordinary raiders. They came in numbers, fleets moving with a precision that belied the chaos they carried. Their ships hugged the coasts, darting into bays and river mouths before any watchtower could light its warning fire. Where they landed, they struck with terrifying swiftness, overwhelming garrisons before a messenger could ride inland. Cities that had traded with strangers for centuries now found themselves at war with them, and discovered too late that the strangers knew exactly where their defences were weakest. The accounts that survive from this first wave are sparse, like fragments of a dream upon waking. One letter from a Ugaritic official speaks of enemy ships sighted on the horizon and pleas for allied reinforcements. Another, never sent, was found in the city's ruins, its clay hardened in the fires that consumed the town. Egyptian inscriptions hint at northern peoples bringing entire families in tow, their women and children travelling with them, as though this was not a mere raid but a migration with purpose. The sea peoples brought weapons that were at once familiar and strange. Curved swords gleamed in the sun, shorter and sharper than the long slashing blades of the Mycenaeans. Round shields of layered hide offered both protection and mobility, and their helmets, some crowned with tall feathered crests, gave them a presence both fierce and otherworldly. To those who faced them, they must have seemed like figures from an old myth, warriors conjured from the sea's own fury, and yet amid the terror there was fascination. Survivors spoke of the intricate tattoos that marked some of the fighters, the strange patterns woven into their clothing, the haunting chants they sang as they rode. They did not speak the languages of the coastlands, but in battle they moved with an unspoken unity, as if the sea had taught them a single tongue. Those who were spared, whether by chance or by design, often found themselves wondering what drove such a people: hunger, vengeance, or a vision of a world remade. As their fleets moved from coast to coast, the great powers of the Bronze Age began to take notice. Mycenaean envoys returned from the Aegean with tales of harbours stripped bare and islands left smouldering. Hittite messengers arrived at foreign courts, speaking of ports in Anatolia that no longer answered calls for aid. In Egypt, scribes began recording these encounters with greater urgency, marking the first time the term sea peoples appeared in the annals of history, not as a name of honour, but as a warning. The Mediterranean had always been a highway of exchange, its waters crossed by to merchants, diplomats, and wanderers. But now it was something else, a hunting ground, and the sea peoples were its most skilled predators. Their oars beat like the pulse of a great heart, their sails bellied with the wind, carrying them toward the next unsuspecting shore. The world had not yet understood that this was only the beginning. Soon the shape of the age itself would be rewritten, not by kings or treaties, but by the shadow of those ships against the light. The first fires were seen from the watchtowers long before the shouts reached the gates. In the soft evening light, smoke smudged the horizon where the sea met the land. To the towns of the Levantine coast, places like Dor, Ashkelon, and the once proud Ugarit, such a sight had long been rare, a mark of some accident in the hinterlands or the burning of stubble after harvest. But these columns of smoke were darker, thicker, and growing. They moved inland with the wind, and behind them came the sound of oars cutting water and boots striking sand. For centuries, these coastal cities had been open doors to the sea, their harbours lined with ships from Crete, Cyprus, and Egypt. Their markets knew the laughter of strangers and the rattle of foreign coin. A ship on the horizon usually meant business, friendship, or the arrival of some new luxury: ivory from Africa, fine pottery from the Aegean, spices from beyond the deserts. But now, when the sails appeared, they were strange and swift, the hulls low and bristling with warriors rather than cargo. The sea peoples struck like a blade sliding between armour plates, not in the manner of wandering pirates, but with the precision of a well-practiced army. They chose their targets carefully. The first cities to fall were those without strong inland allies, where the walls faced the sea, but not the land. They came at dusk or in the fog of morning, when the shadows lay long and confusion reigned. From the shore, they fanned out into narrow streets, their movements disciplined, cutting off escape routes before the alarm could spread. One of the most haunting records we have comes from the ruins of Ugarit. In a half-baked tablet found centuries later, a royal scribe had begun a letter to the king of Alasia, modern Cyprus, pleading for urgent aid. "The enemy's ships are here," it reads. "They have set fire to my cities, and they have done evil things in my country." The letter was never sent. The clay hardened not in the sun, but in the fire that consumed the city. That unfinished tablet speaks louder than any completed record, its abrupt end like a breath cut short. Eyewitness fragments from other cities echo the same pattern. The attackers spared no storehouse, granary, or temple treasury. Gold and bronze were taken, food supplies seized or destroyed, and any ship that could be floated away was either claimed or burned to deny its use to others. Survivors often fled inland, carrying what they could, their voices becoming the living messengers of destruction. In some cases, entire coastal populations disappeared from the archaeological record for generations, their cities left as blackened shells until new settlers dared to return. The speed of these assaults unnerved the surrounding powers. The Hittites, already stretched thin by internal unrest, could not respond quickly to aid their vassals. Mycenaean merchants found the routes they once relied upon suddenly dangerous as allied ports became smouldering ruins. Egypt, with its watchful eye over the Levant, received reports of northerners who struck without warning, their numbers too great to be dismissed as a single band of marauders. For those who lived through it, the trauma was both physical and cultural. In the ashes of market squares, once filled with the cries of vendors and the clatter of amphorae, silence fell, a silence so deep that it outlived the memories of names. The clay tablets, charred and fragmented, became the last voices of the lost, shipping manifests frozen mid-entry, letters of trade agreements never signed, inventories of temples that no longer stood. These first cities to fall were the warning bells of a greater calamity, though few recognized it at the time. It was easy, perhaps, for inland kings to believe that the threat was confined to the coast, that their walls and armies would shield them. But the sea peoples did not intend to vanish after a few raids. They were moving with purpose, and each harbour they took became a foothold for the next. The Levantine shore, once the welcoming threshold of a connected world, was becoming a string of broken gates, each one swinging open to an enemy the land had never known before. The fires of those first cities would not be the last. They were the opening act in a storm that was still gathering, a tide that would soon reach the halls of kings and the very heart of the empires. But for the people who watched their homes burn against the darkening sky, the collapse had already begun. In the cool, shadowed halls of Pharaoh Merneptah's court, the air was thick with the scent of incense and the rustle of papyrus. Courtiers moved softly over polished stone, bearing scrolls from the delta garrisons and tablets carried upriver from the coast. The Nile's waters still flowed with their timeless certainty, swelling fields and feeding cities, but the words arriving in the capital were edged with urgency. Watchmen along the northern coast spoke of strange ships sighted at dawn, of settlements plundered before the midday sun reached its height. These were not the Libyan raiders Egypt had fought for generations, nor the desert tribes who came on swift-footed horses. These were sea-borne enemies, numerous, armed and organised, a threat that moved like a tide no fortress could dam. Merneptah was no stranger to war. Son of the great Rameses II, he had inherited not only Egypt's vast wealth, but its long list of enemies. In the early years of his reign, he had marched his armies west to face Libyan incursions, defeating a coalition that included foreign allies from distant coasts. The victory was inscribed in bold relief on temple walls, the pharaoh shown smiting enemies beneath the gaze of the gods. Yet even in the carved triumphs there is a shadow, the mention of peoples of the sea among the fallen, their strange names preserved in hieroglyphs as though to ward them off by the act of naming. Egypt's scribes, masters of precision, wrote of these northerners with a mixture of confidence and unease. On one hand, their texts praise the pharaoh's strength, declaring that he laid them low, their seed is not. On the other, they admit the scale of the challenge, that the enemy came in numbers large enough to threaten the delta itself, that their attack was not a mere raid but an attempt to carve out a foothold in the fertile lands of the two kingdoms. The Nile Delta, wide and marshy, was Egypt's front door to the Mediterranean, and to lose control, there would be to invite chaos into the heart of the realm. Messengers from the coast brought news of villages emptied, their granaries stripped, their fishing fleets taken or burned. Some settlements had been spared outright destruction, only to find themselves cut off from trade, their harbours unsafe. Egyptian patrols reported encountering enemy ships with prows high as rooftops, their decks crowded with warriors in horned or feathered helmets. Unlike the merchant vessels that usually plied these waters, these ships seemed built for speed and ramming. Their hulls narrow, their crews well drilled, Merneptah ordered the mobilization of the delta's defences, not only the trained chariot corps, but archers, spearmen, and the local militias that could be raised from the villages. Warships were launched from the great shipyards, their oarsmen chanting in unison as they took to the river mouths. It was not enough to meet the sea peoples on land. They had to be driven back on the water, denied the chance to land in strength. Egyptian commanders, seasoned in fighting desert and steppe, now had to learn the tactics of the sea. The pharaoh's inscriptions tell us that Egypt prevailed, that the invaders were thrown back into the waves. In the official version, the victory was decisive. Their forces scattered like chaff before the wind. Yet history carved in stone does not always speak in the same voice as history lived by the people. The absence of further detail about the sea peoples in the following years suggests that while Egypt held its ground, the threat was not extinguished. It had been delayed, turned aside, but not defeated forever. In the years after Merneptah's campaigns, the delta remained under watch, its fortresses maintained in readiness. The memory of the sea peoples lingered like the taste of salt in the wind, a reminder that Egypt's vast wealth, its temples and cities, could tempt even the most distant strangers. And as Egypt's gaze turned inward, repairing what the incursions had strained, the sea peoples were not idle. Elsewhere along the Mediterranean's rim, their fleets gathered strength, their eyes still drawn to the green and gold of the Nile's mouth. For now, Egypt stood unbroken. The great river still swelled each year, the granaries were full, and the temples rang with hymns to gods who had seen the kingdom through centuries of trials. But beyond the delta marshes, the horizon was no longer a simple line of blue and gold. It was a place where sails might rise at any moment, where the calm sea might turn suddenly to war. And though the pharaoh's victories were written in the eternal script of stone, the sea peoples had written themselves into Egypt's story as well, and their chapter was not yet closed. In the final days of Ugarit, the city still breathed the familiar rhythm of trade, but it was a shallow breath, tight with unease. The markets opened at dawn, as they always had, their stalls heavy with amphorae of oil, copper ingots, fine textiles, and the glinting shells of jewellery brought from distant shores. Scribes still bent over their clay tablets, pressing the sharp tips of their styluses into the damp surface, recording shipments and debts, marriage contracts, and prayers. But somewhere beyond the horizon, in the deep blue, where the sea met the sky, danger was already drawing near. One tablet found centuries later in the blackened ruins tells the story in a few urgent lines. Addressed to the king of Alashia, it pleads for help. The enemy's ships are here. They have set fire to my cities. They have done evil things in my country. The words end abruptly, the sentence unfinished, as though the scribe had been torn from his work before the inkless marks could harden into permanence. The tablet was baked not in the sun, but in the fire that consumed the building around it, preserving forever the moment when time in Ugarit simply stopped. Ugarit had been a jewel of the Levant, a place where Egypt, Anatolia, and the Aegean met over ledgers and wine cups. Its harbours welcomed ships from every known coast. Its streets echoed with the chatter of traders in many languages. In its royal palace, painted walls told stories of gods and heroes, and in its archives, rows upon rows of clay tablets held treaties with kings and lists of tribute from vassals. Here the Bronze Age seemed solid, dependable, eternal, and yet within days all of it would vanish into silence. The attack did not come as a single sudden blow. For weeks before the end, rumours had washed ashore with each new merchant ship. Rumours of strange fleets seizing coastal towns, of inland allies failing to send aid, of routes growing dangerous. The king sent messages to the Hittite court and to Alashia, but replies came too slowly. The sea peoples, if that is who they were, moved faster than the ink could dry. On the day they arrived, the sea itself seemed to darken with the mass of ships. Witnesses, the few who survived her, spoke of the drums, deep and steady, echoing across the water. The attackers poured ashore in disciplined ranks, their shields flashing, their helmets crested with feathers or horns. Ugarit's defenders fought, but the city's walls had been built for ceremony and show as much as for war. The gates fell quickly. Fires bloomed in the market square, spreading to the warehouses where the season's grain was stored. The air thickened with smoke and the cries of the wounded. The palace did not last much longer. Once the attackers breached the main hall, the scribes scattered, some trying to carry tablets to safety, others breaking them to keep their contents from enemy hands. The temples, too, were stripped, their statues taken or defaced, their altars overturned. In the harbour, the last merchant ships were either seized or set alight, their masts collapsing into the flames. There would be no escape by sea. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins millennia later, they found layers of ash thick enough to hide the city's streets. Beneath them, the tablets lay as they had fallen, many mid-sentence, as if the city had been caught in the act of speaking. There were records of shipments never completed, letters never sent, and treaties that would never be honoured. The archives, once the pride of Ugarit, became a frozen moment of panic, the diary of a civilization's final day. In the decades that followed, Ugarit's name vanished from contemporary records. No king rose to reclaim it. No neighbouring power rebuilt it. The once busy harbour silted over, the palaces collapsed into rubble, and the winds carried sand into the empty streets. By the time travellers passed that stretch of coast again, the city was nothing more than a memory, its stones worn smooth by the tide. The vanishing of Ugarit was more than the loss of a single city. It was the erasure of a vital link in the Bronze Age world, a link that had bound empires together in trade, diplomacy, and shared culture. When it was cut, the network around it began to fray. The Sea Peoples had not only taken a port, they had taken away a hub of the known world's heartbeat. And in that silence, the first true tremor of the Bronze Age's collapse could be felt. In the highlands of Anatolia, where the winds sweep cold over ridges and the rivers run swift toward the sea, the Hittite Empire had once stood like an unshakable wall. From their capital at Hattusa, the great kings ruled a dominion that stretched from the mountains of the north to the warm coasts of the Levant, from the Aegean's fringe to the edges of Mesopotamia. Their roads were broad and disciplined, lined with way stations for messengers who could carry a royal order across the empire in days. Their palaces were fortified with stone and earth, their walls carved with scenes of kings clasping hands with gods, as if eternity itself had been promised to them. And yet, in the space of a single generation, this empire vanished, leaving behind a silence as deep as the winter snows that once crowned its gates. When the end came, it left no single clear scar. There is no triumphant enemy inscription proclaiming the fall of Hattusa, no great battle carved into the walls of a conqueror's temple. Instead, there are absences, archives that cease mid-record, diplomatic letters that were never answered, storehouses found half empty, as if abandoned in haste. The royal roads, once kept in meticulous repair, fell to disuse. Grass grew between their stones, and the way stations became lairs for foxes and birds. The empire's voice, so confident in its treaties and decrees, simply stopped speaking. Theories of this disappearance multiply like shadows in the twilight. Some scholars see in the layers of earth a story of famine, years when the harvest failed, when grain convoys never arrived, and when the cities could no longer feed their own. Letters between the Hittite court and Egypt speak of pleas for shipments of grain, couched in the language of diplomacy but edged with desperation. Others see signs of rebellion, of subject kingdoms seizing their chance when the centre's grip loosened. The Hittite kings had ruled over a patchwork of peoples. Loyalty was maintained by strength, and strength was costly to display when every year brought new strains on resources. And then there is the shadow of the Sea Peoples. Their name appears in records from neighbouring lands during the same window of time, always as a destructive force moving along the coasts. While Hattusa itself lay inland, the empire depended on its coastal ports for trade, for the copper, tin, and luxury goods that bound its economy together. If those ports fell, the empire's arteries would have been severed. Imagine the merchant fleets of the empire's southern harbours, seized or sunk, their warehouses stripped bare. Inland cities might stand for a while, but without the lifeblood of trade, their decline would be swift. The archaeology offers glimpses of a struggle, burned layers in some towns, hastily built fortifications in others. But these signs are scattered, more like embers than a single raging fire. Perhaps the fall of the Hittites was not a single blow, but the slow collapse of a structure too strained to bear its own weight. Famine weakened it, rebellion cracked it, and the Sea Peoples struck the final, splintering blows along its vulnerable edges. In Hattusa, the great gates still stand, though they open onto silence. The Lion Gate, with its massive carved sentinels, once saw processions of soldiers and priests, merchants and messengers. Now, in the years after the fall, those same gates looked out on empty roads, and fields gone wild. The carved reliefs of kings in divine embrace no longer received offerings. The archives, once busy with the scratch of styluses on clay, gathered dust in the dim light. Some tablets left unfired and crumbling. What must it have felt like, in those final days, for a scribe to arrive at the palace and find the king's court half empty, for a farmer to bring grain to market and find the stalls unmanned, for a messenger to ride the royal road and find no one at the way station to give him water? These small silences, multiplied across the land, were the true sound of the Hittite collapse. The Sea Peoples did not stay to rule Anatolia. Theirs was not an empire-building conquest, but a storm that broke and moved on. Yet their passage may have left the Hittites fatally exposed, their ports lost, their trade strangled. In their absence, smaller kingdoms would rise in the shadows of the old power, speaking new languages and making new alliances. But the great kings were gone, their archives buried, their roads grown over, their gods standing alone in the wind. It is this silence, deliberate, total, and absolute, that haunts the historian. We can read the words of their treaties, the inventories of their storerooms, the victories carved in stone, but we cannot hear the moment when the voices stopped. The Hittite Empire, so secure in its own endurance, left history not with a final roar, but with the closing of a door no one ever opened again. In the hills of the Peloponnese, where the air still carries the scent of thyme and sea salt, the ruins of Mycenae rise from the earth like the bones of some ancient giant. Its walls, massive cyclopean blocks fitted without mortar, still stand, the Lion Gate staring out with its eternal gaze. To walk here today is to tread the same ground once crossed by kings and warriors, by artisans and slaves, all bound in service to a palace culture that had thrived for centuries. And yet, in the late 13th century BCE, that world began to dim. Its proud centres, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, going dark, one after another, in the flicker of firelight. The palaces of Greece were more than royal residences. They were the beating hearts of their kingdoms, hubs of administration, production, and ceremony. Within their megarons, vast audience halls centred on a great hearth, kings held court, received tribute, and dispatched orders inscribed on thin clay tablets in the script we now call Linear B. Storerooms overflowed with oil, grain, and wine, while workshops rang with the clang of bronze smiths, the steady whir of potters' wheels, and the rhythmic weaving of cloth. Their power was measured not just in armies, but in the scale of their redistribution networks. the ability to take in goods from the countryside and send them forth again, transformed as the will of the palace decreed. Then suddenly, the order unravelled. Archaeology speaks of it in layers of ash and rubble, in charred beams lying where they fell. In Mycenae itself, parts of the citadel burned, the fire intense enough to crack stone and warp metal. At Tyrins, the great wall survived, but the buildings within then bore the marks of violent destruction. Pylos in Messenia offers perhaps the clearest image. Its archives, stored in the palace, were baked hard in the flames, preserving hundreds of tablets that record, in their last entries, hurried preparations for a coming attack. The enemy's identity is never named. The causes of this twilight remain a tapestry of possibility. Some point to external invasion, perhaps by the same seaborne raiders who haunted the eastern Mediterranean, the sea peoples whose fleets struck without warning. Others suspect civil strife, rival factions within the palace elite turning on one another as resources grew scarce. Still others see a wider chain reaction. Drought and famine weakening the land, trade disruptions starving the palaces of tin and copper, the materials needed to maintain their armies and economies. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. The intricate machinery of the palace system seized up, and the lights of its great halls went out. The human cost is harder to measure, but easier to imagine. In the burned layers of Pylos, archaeologists have found collapsed walls where pottery jars still lay intact, sealed with their last harvest of oil. In smaller towns, signs of sudden abandonment suggest that villagers fled before the flames reached them, carrying what they could along roads that may no longer have led anywhere safe. The collapse of one palace did not merely leave a gap in leadership, it disrupted the entire web of production, distribution, and protection on which life depended. In the absence of their palaces, the people of the Mycenaean world faced choices. Some retreated to the hills, building smaller, more defensible settlements. Others may have taken to the sea, joining the restless migrations that were reshaping the coasts from Anatolia to Canaan. Still others stayed among the ruins, scavenging stone from the fallen halls to build humbler homes. The monumental gateways and storerooms became the domain of goats and weeds, their painted walls fading under the sun. Yet, even as the political and economic order crumbled, fragments of Mycenaean culture endured. Pottery styles persisted for a time, and some Linear B writing continued in reduced form, suggesting that small pockets of administration survived in the shadow of the fallen centres. The Mycenaean world did not disappear in a single night, but the fires marked a clear turning, from the age of kings and palaces to something far less centralised, far more precarious. To stand among the ruins today, with the cicadas buzzing and the stones warm underfoot, is to feel both the weight of that loss and the strange continuity of human life. The Lion Gate still watches over Mycenae, though it guards only an echo. The Megaron of Pylos still reveals its great hearth, though no king sits beside it, and in the charred beams and shattered jars, the night when the world shifted still lingers, a reminder that even the mightiest. Walls cannot keep out the turning of the age. They did not all come with spears in hand. Some came with the last of their possessions wrapped in cloth, their children clinging to their sides, their eyes fixed not on conquest, but on survival. In the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, as cities burned and palaces fell, the Mediterranean witnessed not only the movement of warriors, but the slow, desperate migration of entire communities. The sea, for generations, a path of trade and shared culture, now became a road out of ruin. In small harbours of the Aegean, families would have gathered at dawn, loading narrow ships with whatever their strength could carry. Amphorae filled with grain, baskets of dried figs, goats tied in the stern, tools wrapped carefully in woven cloth. Clay jars held seeds from their homeland's fields, wheat, barley, lentils, not as trade goods, but as the promise of planting again. The old and the very young were lifted aboard first, their faces drawn tight against the uncertainty of the voyage. Every departure was final. There would be no letters sent home, no return when the danger passed. Some routes followed the familiar stepping stones of the islands, from Euboea to Rhodes, from Cyprus to the shores of Canaan. Others struck out into open water, guided by stars and the memory of traders' maps. Along the way, they would have stopped at whatever harbours were still safe, trading for water and salted fish, mending sails with borrowed hands. The lucky ones found welcome among coastal villages. The less fortunate were turned away by towns already stretched thin by famine and fear. The archaeological record leaves faint traces of these journeys. In the ruins of Canaanite cities, new pottery styles appear abruptly, shapes and decorations resembling those of the Aegean rather than the Levant. Cooking practices shift. Hearths and bread ovens are built in unfamiliar designs. Graves begin to hold both local ornaments and foreign ones mingled in the same soil. These are the fingerprints of resettlement, of strangers becoming neighbours, and over time, kin. Life on the journey itself must have been a fragile balance between hope and dread. A sudden storm could dash a ship against unseen rocks. Pirates, some perhaps kin to the very sea peoples, who terrorised the coasts, might strip a vessel of food and leave it adrift. Illness could spread quickly in the cramped quarters, and the loss of a single oar or sail might mean days stranded at sea. Yet the alternative, remaining in a homeland of smouldering ruins, was no choice at all. Those who survived landfall faced another beginning. The fields they found might be rocky, the water brackish, the local lords wary. Many would have taken to the coasts, fishing or working as labourers, while slowly building new homes of mud brick or timber. Their children learned the language of the land, while keeping the songs and stories of the old country alive in the evenings. In our time, marriages linked them to the local families, their customs blending into a new identity that still carried the shadows of the old. In the biblical tradition, echoes of such migrations linger, memories of sea peoples settling along the coast, of foreign tribes arriving with new gods and new ways. The Philistines, remembered as one of these groups, may have been the descendants of just such refugees, their roots tangled between the Aegean and the Levant. In their pottery, in their foods, in their worship, traces of distant homelands survived, refracted through the generations. For the migrants themselves, each sunrise in the new land must have carried both relief and grief. Relief at the safety of solid ground, the sound of children laughing again, the smell of bread baking over a hearth. Grief at the absence of familiar hills, of ancestors' graves, of the old gods whose temples now lay in ruin. The sea that had carried them away was no longer a friend, but a reminder of loss, wide, restless, and forever between them and the soil where they were born. Not all who crossed the waves came with swords. Many came with empty hands, and in those hands, seeds. They would never again see the homes they left behind, but in the furrows of new fields and the laughter of new generations, some part of their homeland would live on. In this way, the exodus of peoples was not only a story of endings, but of beginnings, fragile, uncertain, and quietly enduring. In the second decade of the 12th century BCE, the Nile flowed as it always had, swelling the fields and feeding the cities of Egypt. Yet in the court of Ramesses III, the air was taut with the knowledge that something vast was moving toward them, a tide of peoples from the north, greater than any the kingdom had yet faced. These were no mere raiding parties. The reports from the coast spoke of entire fleets, row upon row of ships laden not only with warriors, but with women, children, oxen and carts. This was migration bound up with invasion, and the delta would be the crucible where it was decided whether Egypt would hold. The pharaoh's temple at Medinet Habu preserves the most vivid account of what followed. Across its walls, The scenes unfold in unbroken procession, ships crashing together on the waves, their prows locked like the horns of fighting beasts. Archers in tall plumed helmets sending volleys of arrows into the enemy ranks. Warriors tumbling into the water, their shields spinning away on the current. Rameses himself is shown larger than life, bow drawn, chariot poised, the divine warrior king defending the two lands. Beneath these images, hieroglyphic inscriptions tell the story with royal certainty. The sea peoples came from the islands in the midst of the sea, and Egypt crushed them utterly. But the stone speaks with the voice of propaganda, not confession. Even in victory, the danger was real enough to be immortalized in the most sacred of spaces, carved deep into the walls so that no future generation could forget. The sea peoples had reached the very threshold of Egypt's heartland. They had fought not just at sea, but on the delta's marshy plains, where Egyptian chariots struggled to maneuver. To stop them, Rameses had to marshal the full force of his navy and army, coordinating land and river defences with precision. The reliefs may show the pharaoh alone on the prow, but in truth, survival depended on every archer, every oarsman, every fortified position, holding under pressure. The inscriptions describe how Egypt's ships formed a defensive barrier in the mouths of the Nile, forcing the invaders into narrow channels where they could not maneuver freely. Archers rained arrows from the decks while grappling hooks pulled enemy ships close for boarding. On land, charioteers and infantry clashed with columns of the sea peoples, whose ranks included fighters from many tribes, their horned and feathered helmets marking them as outsiders, their curved swords glinting under the sun. The battle was fierce enough that even the official record lingers on its chaos, speaking of the enemy overturned and laid low in their places. When it was over, Egypt stood. The surviving invaders were captured or slain, their families taken as prisoners. Some, the records claim, were settled in garrison towns along Egypt's borders, perhaps as a means of control, perhaps because they could not be sent back to lands that no longer existed. The pharaoh had won a decisive victory, one that would be remembered as the moment Egypt repelled the great migration of the north. Yet beneath the triumph, there was a quiet truth. Egypt had faced an enemy unlike any it had known, and it had done so at great cost. The resources poured into the delta's defense could not be easily replaced. Trade routes had been disrupted, coastal allies weakened or erased. Even within Egypt, signs of strain began to appear in the years after Rameses III's reign. Labour strikes among tomb builders, shortages of grain, political intrigue that gnawed at the authority of the throne. Egypt would endure for centuries more, but never again as the unchallenged giant of the eastern Mediterranean. The walls of Medinet Habu still stand, their carvings sharp despite the passing of 3,000 years, but they're both a monument to victory and a memorial to the moment when Egypt's supremacy began to wane. The sea peoples had not conquered the Nile, but they had changed it forever, showing that even the mightiest kingdom could be brought to the brink. And so, in the flickering torchlight of the temple, the carved battles seem almost to move, oars dipping, arrows flying, the pharaoh's bow drawn tight. The story they tell is one of defiance and survival, but in the stillness between the lines, there is another story, of a world shifting, of an age ending, and of a river kingdom that had stood against the tide, only to find that the tide was still rising elsewhere. The end of the Bronze Age was not a single clean break, but a slow unravelling, threads snapping one by one, until the tapestry collapsed under its own weight. The sea peoples, with their swift ships and coordinated assaults, were the most visible actors in the drama, but they were neither its only cause nor its sole architects. Across the eastern Mediterranean, a wider and more complex web of crises was tightening, each strand pulling against the others, each weakness amplifying the rest. The climate was shifting. Studies of ancient pollen and lake sediments tell of years when the rains faltered and the skies offered only relentless sun. Crops withered in their fields, river levels fell, and the once dependable rhythms of planting and harvest turned unreliable. A series of drought years could push even the richest kingdom to the brink, and for smaller polities dependent on imports, famine might come within a single bad season. Grain, the foundation of every palace economy, became a commodity guarded as fiercely as gold. The land itself seemed restless. Inscriptions and archaeological layers point to a period of increased seismic activity, earthquakes that rattled the coasts and cracked the walls of cities from Crete to Anatolia. The mighty walls of some palaces were found toppled without signs of fire or battle, their destruction written in jagged fault lines rather than sword cuts. In a world already strained, such disasters could strip a kingdom of its defences, leaving it open to both rebellion and foreign attack. Political stability was no stronger than the grain bins and trade routes that supported it. The great empires, Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaean kingdoms, had built their power on networks of vassals, tribute, and carefully maintained alliances. But these were delicate structures. A missed shipment of tin from the east could mean fewer bronze weapons for the army. A failed harvest in a vassal state could mean unpaid tribute and unrest. When the Hittite Empire faltered under these pressures, its subjects seized their chance for independence. When Mycenaean kings found their coffers shrinking, internal rivalries deepened into open strife. Into this fragile world came the Sea Peoples, not in isolation, but as both a cause and a symptom of the collapse. Their attacks disrupted trade at the very moment kingdoms needed it most, severing access to critical resources. At the same time, the disorder and weakness created by famine, earthquakes, and political fragmentation gave them an opening. A coastal city short on grain and soldiers was far easier prey than one flush with resources and unity. Refugees from burned cities added another layer to the storm. Some joined the ranks of the Sea Peoples, swelling their numbers. Others flooded into neighbouring lands, straining already overtaxed resources. In some regions, these population shifts altered the cultural landscape within a single generation. New languages, new customs, and new alliances replacing the old order. The very idea of a stable, continuous civilization began to fray. The perfect storm metaphor is almost too neat. Yet in this case, it fits. No single factor was sufficient to bring down the interconnected world of the Bronze Age, but together they created a cascade from which there was no recovery. The Sea Peoples may have been the spark that lit the pyre, but the wood had been drying for decades under the sun of drought, the tremors of the earth and the quiet erosion of trust between rulers. By the time the tide of invasions ebbed, the map of the eastern Mediterranean had been redrawn. Great palaces lay in ruins, trade routes were broken, and entire scripts, like Linear B in Greece or Hittite cuneiform in Anatolia, fell into disuse. In their place emerged smaller, more localized powers, better suited to survival in an age where the networks that had bound the old world together were gone. And yet, even as the old order fell, people endured. Farmers planted new fields in the shadow of collapsed walls. Traders set out on shorter, riskier voyages to whatever port still stood. Storytellers began weaving the events of these years into myth, their tales carrying fragments of memory, of a time when the sea was full of strangers, and the world itself seemed to shift beneath their feet. When the last embers cooled and the smoke drifted away over the horizon, the world that emerged bore little resemblance to the one that had stood a generation before. The palatial centres, the grand courts of kings, and the long threads of international trade were gone. In their place rose smaller, leaner societies, kingdoms and city-states born from necessity rather than inherited grandeur. The Mediterranean had not been emptied, but it had been remade. Along the southern coast of Canaan, new cities began to take shape. Archaeology tells us that in places like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza, a distinct culture emerged. one with pottery styles, architectural forms, and cooking habits that bore clear marks of Aegean influence. These were the Philistines, remembered in biblical tradition as adversaries of the Israelites, but perhaps themselves the descendants of those who had crossed the sea during the Great Upheaval. Whether warriors, refugees, or both, they brought with them a blend of old homeland traditions and adaptations to their new surroundings, becoming a people rooted in two worlds. In Anatolia, the land once bound under the Hittite crown fractured into a patchwork of smaller states. Some were ruled by local dynasties that claimed descent from Hittite kings. Others were entirely new powers, rising in regions once overshadowed by the imperial centre. Trade persisted, but now it was more regional, less dependent on the sprawling, fragile networks that had once spanned continents. Old capitals like Hattusa lay in ruins, their roads overgrown, but in places like Carchemish and Tarsus, life continued, adapted to the smaller scale of the post-collapse age. Greece entered what later historians would call a dark age, a time without monumental palaces or the linear B writing system, but not without resilience. Small village communities grew where once mighty citadels had stood. The art of bronze working persisted, though in reduced volume, and oral traditions began to preserve the memory of the fallen Mycenaean world. From these oral traditions, centuries later, would come the epic poetry of Homer, stories of siege and wanderings that may have carried echoes of the Bronze Age's final storms. Egypt, though it had survived the assaults of the Sea Peoples under Rameses III, did not emerge unscathed. Its influence in the Levant waned, its foreign holdings slipping away to local rulers and new powers. Internal struggles, economic strain, and the gradual decentralization of authority signaled that the great river kingdom had passed its peak. The monumental temples still rose along the Nile, but their inscriptions began to speak more of preservation than expansion. For those living in the aftermath, survival meant adaptation. Farming shifted to crops that could endure uncertain weather patterns. Trade routes, though diminished, became more flexible, seeking smaller markets closer to home. In many places, the political order was more localized, leadership grounded in personal authority rather than the distant word of an imperial court. The grand diplomatic correspondences of the Amarna age were gone. Alliances were forged face to face, between neighbours rather than far-off kings. Culturally, the collapse did not erase the past, it transformed it. Pottery shapes from the Aegean found new expressions in Canaanite clay. Hittite artistic motifs blended with those of the Aramaeans. Egyptian symbols and deities persisted in coastal sanctuaries long after Egypt's armies had departed. The age that followed was one of mingling and reinvention, where identities were fluid and shaped by necessity. For the historian, this period is a paradox, a time of loss and destruction, yet also one of quiet resilience. Without the glittering courts and centralized archives of the Bronze Age, fewer records survive, making the age seem silent. But beneath that silence lay countless small acts of endurance: a fisherman repairing his net on a new shore, a potter adapting a foreign design to local clay, a mother teaching her child the language of her ancestors while he played among the streets of a new city. The end of the Bronze Age was not the end of civilization, it was the close of a chapter, one in which great empires had stretched their hands across the sea and believed their order would last forever. What rose in its place was smaller, more fragmented, but also more adaptable. In time, new powers would grow from these seeds: the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Phoenician trading cities, the Greek polis, but they would grow in a world forever marked by the memory of collapse and by the knowledge that even the mightiest age can pass into history's tide. In the stillness of a museum storeroom, under the soft hum of climate control, lies a tray of corroded bronze spearheads. Their edges are dulled by centuries, their patina the green of deep water. They were pulled from the earth near a ruined coastal settlement. their points aligned with layers of ash and toppled walls. To the archaeologist, they are more than weapons. They are fragments of a story, clues to a moment when strangers came from the sea and the world shifted around them. Yet even with thousands of such finds, the sea peoples remain shadows, their faces blurred as though history itself resists the attempt to give them shape. Excavations along the coasts of the Levant, Cyprus, and the Aegean have yielded traces of their passage. Burn layers in cities like Ugarit and Ashkelon speak of fire that came swiftly and consumed completely. In some sites, the destruction is mingled with change. New styles of pottery appear abruptly in the layers above, the shapes and motifs foreign to the land beneath them. This is the archaeologist's version of a voice half heard, a shift in the rhythm of daily life that hints at newcomers but does not name them. Among the most telling finds are the remnants of ships, or rather, their ghosts. In the harbours of ancient cities, divers have found anchors carved from limestone, their designs matching those seen in reliefs at Medinet Habu, where Rameses III carved his victory over the invaders. Wooden fragments preserved in silt suggest long, narrow hulls built for speed and manoeuvre, but these remains are rare. The sea reclaims its dead, and the ships of the sea peoples seem to have left little behind but the impressions they made in the memories of those who fought them. Other discoveries are small and intimate. A cooking pot of Aegean form found in a Canaanite house, a loom weight carved from a foreign stone, a child's burial containing both local and imported ornaments. These suggest more than mere conquest. They speak of settlement, of mingling, of the gradual blending of cultures in the wake of upheaval. But whether these artifacts belong to the sea peoples themselves, to refugees who travelled with them, or to locals adapting to new influences is a question the soil does not answer. The written record, too, is a puzzle of fragments. Egyptian inscriptions name certain groups: Sherden, Shekelesh, Peleset, Denian, but their origins remain debated. Are these tribal names, place names, or titles given by outsiders? Clay tablets from the Levant speak in hurried tones of northerners or peoples from the sea, but never pause to describe their faces, their languages, or their leaders. It is as if the chroniclers themselves could not or would not define them too closely, as if to name them precisely was to grant them permanence. For archaeologists, the challenge is not only in the scarcity of evidence, but in the nature of the sea peoples themselves. If they were a confederation, a loose alliance of displaced groups, then there may be no single material culture to find, no unified set of customs to trace. What survives would be a patchwork, each piece belonging to a different strand of the greater tide. This makes their trail diffuse, a scattering of footprints in sand that shifts with every season. And yet, there is a kind of poetry in this elusiveness. The sea peoples entered history suddenly, struck with force, and then dissolved into it, absorbed into the societies they touched or vanished beyond the reach of written memory. They are like the outlines left by a wave that has retreated, visible only in the way it rearranged the shore. Each spearhead, each charred timber, each pothered is a whisper of their passing, incomplete but undeniably real. In the end, the search for the sea peoples is as much about the questions as the answers. Every excavation that uncovers a burned layer invites us to imagine the moment of impact. Every foreign-style artifact found far from its place of origin asks us to picture the hands that carried it. The sea peoples remain elusive, not because they were ghosts, but because they were human, and humanity, in motion, is rarely simple to pin down. In the centuries after the sails of the sea, peoples faded from the horizon. Their memory did not vanish, it shifted. History, when retold around hearth fires and in the shadow of temple columns, rarely remains untouched. The events that had once been recorded in hurried letters and carved on palace walls began to take on new forms, shapes softened by distance, coloured by fear pride, and the need for meaning. The Sea Peoples became less a coalition of flesh and blood migrants and warriors, and more an idea, a living embodiment of chaos, destiny, and the sea's untamable will. In some coastal villages, elders told stories of the day the sea walked ashore. They spoke of ships with prows like the heads of monsters, of warriors whose helmets bristled with feathers or horns, and of voices raised in a language no one could understand. To children born long after the fires had gone cold, these were not details of history, but scenes from a fable, reminders that the ocean could give as easily as it could take. The story was told to teach caution, to warn against trusting too much in calm horizons. In temple inscriptions, the Sea Peoples became a foil for the god's power. Egyptian reliefs depicted them as the ultimate foreign threat, a swirling mass of enemies brought low by divine favour and the pharaoh's might. In this framing, the invasions were not simply geopolitical crises, but cosmic tests, proof that order could be restored only through the intervention of both king and deity. Over time, the identities of the invaders blurred, their distinct tribal names collapsing into a single category, the nameless threats from beyond the known world. In the oral traditions of lands they touched and perhaps settled, the memory could take on a different tone. Among the descendants of migrants who may have been part of that great tide, the journey was cast not as an invasion, but as an odyssey, a tale of survival, of leaving behind a land swallowed by famine or fire and seeking a new home across the sea. In these tellings, the Sea Peoples were not faceless destroyers, but ancestors, their courage in the face of exile a source of identity and pride. Poets of the early Iron Age sometimes drew on the shadow of these events without naming them outright. Epic cycles from the Aegean spoke of long voyages, of cities sacked and heroes wandering from shore to shore. While these works cannot be taken as direct histories, the echoes of a time when entire peoples were set adrift on the sea seem to resonate within their verses. The chaos of the late Bronze Age may well have seeded the imaginations of generations of storytellers, shaping myths that reached far beyond the events themselves. Over the centuries, the truth became harder to separate from the stories built upon it. The Sea Peoples became a symbol that could be invoked to explain any sudden catastrophe from the sea. A mysterious fleet, a disastrous storm, the unexplained ruin of a coastal town. To speak of them was to evoke an old, familiar fear that from beyond the horizon might come a force against which walls, armies, and even the will of kings might falter. For modern historians and archaeologists, this blending of fact and legend is both a challenge and a gift. The myths obscure the details, the dates, the numbers, the precise origins, but they also preserve the emotional truth of the age. They tell us how the people who lived through it felt, awed, frightened, bewildered, sometimes proud of their survival, sometimes haunted by their loss. The Sea Peoples may be elusive in the archaeological record, but in memory, whether as villains, wanderers, or harbingers, they never truly left. And so, when we look back at the late Bronze Age, we are not only sifting through the ash of burned cities or the green crust of ancient bronze, we are also peering into the long afterlife of the story, watching as history becomes myth, and myth in turn becomes a mirror. In that mirror, each generation sees what it most needs to see, a warning, a memory, or a legend that keeps the horizon forever a place of mystery. When the Bronze Age world fell into shadow, it was not only its palaces, cities, and kings that vanished. Words disappeared too, the shapes and sounds by which people had once recorded their lives. Clay tablets and inked scrolls lay abandoned, their meanings sealed like seeds in the dark. Linear B, Hittite cuneiform, Ugaritic script. Whole systems of writing that had pulsed with the everyday work of trade, law, and devotion fell, silent as suddenly and completely as a song cut off mid-verse. The silence of a language is unlike any other ruin. Walls may crumble, statues may erode, but a vanished tongue takes with it the thoughts, idioms, and rhythms of the people who spoke and wrote it. It is not only the messages we lose, but the way those messages were shaped, the metaphors chosen, the word order preferred, the turns of phrase that revealed how a culture saw its world. Without these, the past becomes a little more distant, its inner voice muffled. In the centuries before the collapse, scribes in Mycenaean Greece pressed their styluses into soft clay to write in linear B, keeping careful tallies of grain stores, oil shipments, and offerings to the gods. The Hittite royal chancery filled its archives with tablets in cuneiform, letters to vassals, treaties with neighbours, records of omens read in the stars. In Ugarit, scribes had adapted the cuneiform style into an alphabetic script, swift and versatile, used for everything from merchant accounts to epic poetry. These were not just the tools of elites, they were the very threads that held complex societies together. When the centres that housed them fell, the scribes' rooms were often the last to burn. In Pylos, the palace fire baked its linear B tablets hard, preserving them accidentally for thousands of years, but no one alive could read them by the time the embers cooled. In Hattusa, the great Hittite archives were simply left behind. Many tablets crumbled before they could be found again. Ugarit's alphabetic tablets, some containing lines of myth and song, lay buried under layers of ash until archaeologists uncovered them in the 20th century. What happened to the knowledge of these scripts? In some cases, it may have died with the scribes themselves, who were often trained from childhood in royal or temple schools. When the institutions that supported them collapsed, there was no one left to teach the next generation. Without regular use, the scripts faded from memory in a single lifetime. The survivors of the cities still spoke their languages, Mycenaean Greek, Hittite, Ugaritic, but without the means to write them down, those languages changed more quickly, untethered from their written forms. In time, even the spoken words shifted, blended, or disappeared entirely. There is a profound stillness in holding a tablet inscribed in an extinct script. You can see the careful alignment of the signs, the faint hesitation where a scribe paused before pressing the next wedge or line, but the voice itself is gone. The marks are there, yet the meaning has drifted beyond our reach, like a boat disappearing into the mist. When decipherment comes, as it did for linear B in the 20th century, it is like hearing a voice call faintly across the centuries. But most scripts of the collapse era did not return from their silence. In a sense, the loss of these writing systems is the most complete kind of ruin. A broken wall can be rebuilt, a city resettled, but a forgotten script can only be guessed at unless its key survives. It is an absence that reshapes the landscape of history, forcing us to imagine the countless stories, complaints, love notes, and bargains that were once as common as breath, and are now nothing but dust. And so the silence left by the end of these languages is not empty. It is full of the weight of what is missing, of the recognition that memory is fragile, and that the past can vanish not only in flame and war, but in the quiet forgetting of words. The sea peoples and the collapse they rode upon took cities, kingdoms, and lives, but they also took voices. And in that way, their legacy lingers, not just in stone and ash, but in the spaces between what we know and what we can never recover. Before the collapse, bronze was more than a tool of kings and soldiers. It was the pulse that kept the great civilizations alive. Every blade, plough, and chisel was the product of two distant journeys: copper from Cyprus, tin from lands as far as the mountains of Central Asia or the misty isles of Britain. To make bronze was to join continents in a silent pact of exchange, an unbroken web of ships, caravans, and harbours that carried the lifeblood of the age. The palaces of Mycenae, the halls of Hattusa, the storerooms of Ugarit, and the temples of Egypt all beat to this same rhythm. The routes themselves were as complex as the metal they produced. From the copper mines of Cyprus, heavy ingots, cast in shapes like ox hides for easy transport, were loaded onto ships bound for the Levant, Anatolia, and the Aegean. Tin, rarer and more precious, travelled in smaller quantities, often overland. Through Anatolia from the east, across the deserts from Arabia, or along the river valleys of Mesopotamia. In bustling ports like Ugarit, these two elements met, and the alloy that defined an age was forged, its uses stretching from the farmer's sickle to the warrior's spear. But this delicate lattice of exchange depended on stability. A single disrupted link could ripple outward, slowing or severing supply lines across thousands of miles. When the sea peoples began to move, striking first at coastal cities and then at the ships that stitched the Mediterranean together, the bronze network frayed almost overnight. Merchant convoys could no longer count on safe passage. Harbours that had served as way stations were blackened ruins, their quays empty save for charred pilings jutting from the tide. Shipwrecks tell the story in silence. Off the coast of Uluburun in southern Turkey, a merchant vessel sank in the late 14th century BCE, decades before the collapse. Its cargo, a time capsule of the Bronze Age, in full bloom. Copper ingots, tin, ivory, glass, exotic woods, and luxury goods from more than a dozen regions. By the 12th century, such voyages had become nearly impossible. The seas were no longer a marketplace, but a battleground. Wrecks, from this later period, are rarer and often smaller, coastal traders hugging the shore, avoiding the open water where the fleets of the sea peoples prowled. For the palaces and kingdoms, the loss of trade was more than an inconvenience. Without tin, bronze production dwindled. Without bronze, armies could not be fully equipped. Tools dulled, and agricultural yields suffered. Some regions turned to iron, but in these early years it was brittle, inconsistent, and costly to work. The skill and infrastructure for bronze could not be replaced overnight, and the sudden scarcity reshaped economies from the ground up. The loss of the roots also meant the loss of connection. For centuries, diplomacy had travelled alongside trade, a gift of copper or a shipment of luxury goods, often serving as both commerce and political statement. Without the ships, letters went unanswered, alliances withered, and the shared culture of the Bronze Age, visible in art, architecture, and technology, began to fragment. In the aftermath, smaller-scale exchanges did survive. Fishermen's boats carried grain to neighbouring islands. Local smiths recycled old bronze, melting down heirlooms and weapons to make the essentials of survival. But the grand arteries those sweeping routes that had bound Cyprus to Anatolia, Egypt to the Aegean, Mesopotamia to the Levant, had bled away. What remains now are scattered traces, the green patina of a corroded ingot pulled from a wreck, the faint outline of an ancient harbour wall beneath modern sand, the ghost of a trade network, visible only to those who can connect the fragments. The sea peoples were not the only force that ended it. Drought, famine, and political upheaval all played their part, but their strikes at the coasts and ships were among the final blows. To walk the ruins of an ancient port today is to stand at the edge of what was once a living artery of the world. You can hear only the wind and the lap of the tide, but if you close your eyes you might imagine the creak of rigging, the calls of dock workers, the glint of copper in the sun, the last heartbeat of a network that held an age together before the silence closed in. The ships of the sea peoples come down to us in fragments, carved in stone on the walls of Medinet Habu, scratched in miniature on pottery shards, glimpsed in a few scattered descriptions from their enemies. Yet even in these fragments there is something unmistakable, a grace born of purpose, lines drawn to cleave through water and carry warriors swiftly toward their prey. Their hulls curve like the body of a leaping fish, high at both prow and stern, their long oar banks fanning out like the ribs of some living creature. On the water, they must have seemed alive. The oars dipped and rose in unison, catching the sun in brief flashes as they broke the surface. The hulls were narrow and lean, built for speed rather than heavy cargo, their timbers bound together by mortise and tenon joints that flexed with the swell of the sea. Some carried sails, were rectangular, loose enough to billow in a favourable wind. But in battle, it was the oars that mattered. Under the hands of seasoned crews, these ships could turn sharply, darting in to strike and slipping away before larger vessels could respond. Life aboard was both cramped and exposed. There was no shelter from the elements, except what a man could make for himself beneath a cloak or a scrap of sailcloth. Salt spray stung the skin and dried to a crust on every surface. The sea's roll was constant, a rhythm that never ceased, rocking men to uneasy sleep and waking them with its heave. Food was simple: dried fish, hard bread, olives carried in jar, and water had to be rationed carefully, stored in skins or amphorae that rolled and shifted with the ship's motion. Between raids, the crew worked constantly to keep the vessel seaworthy. Saltwater gnawed at the ropes. Every journey meant scraping barnacles from the hull, retying lashings, and checking for leaks. The timbers swelled and shrank with the weather, and the pitch that sealed the seams had to be reapplied often. The smell aboard would have been a mingling of tar, sweat, fish, and the faint tang of the sea, the scent of a home that was also a weapon. In battle, these ships became extensions of the men who rode and fought on them. Reliefs show archers firing from behind tall shields fixed to the gunwales, spearmen braced for boarding. The high prows were not merely decorative, they were tools of intimidation and impact, meant to crash into enemy hulls or loom over defenders on shore. Grappling hooks could lock ships together, and the narrow decks were quickly transformed into a melee of blades and shouts, the planks slick beneath bare feet. But there must also have been quiet moments, long hours under a hot, unmoving sun, the sea stretching empty in all directions. The crew would have sung to keep the oars in time, low rhythmic chants that carried over the water. At night, when the wind fell, the ship would rock gently under a canopy of stars, the oars shipped, the silence broken only by the slap of waves against the hull. In such moments, the warriors might have spoken of home, of the lands they had left behind, of where the next voyage might take them. The origins of these ships remain as debated as those of the sea peoples themselves. Some scholars see in their construction echoes of Aegean galleys, others of Cypriot merchant vessels adapted for war. The feathered crests on the warriors' helmets carved alongside the ships suggest a mix of influences, a confederation of groups, each bringing its own traditions to the fleet. What united them was not a single homeland, but the sea itself, and the craft that allowed them to master it. When we look at the surviving images, it is tempting to see only the weapon, the swift prow cutting toward its target. But these ships were also lifelines carrying not just fighters, but families, supplies, and the goods taken in raids. In their holds, tools lay beside weapons, amphorae beside shields, seeds beside plunder. They were warships, yes, but also the floating villages of a people in motion. Their decks crowded not just with men, but with the future they carried. To imagine life aboard one of these vessels is to glimpse the dual nature of the sea peoples themselves. Destroyers and settlers, raiders and migrants, bound together in the narrow space of a ship's deck. In the creak of its timbers and the hiss of its prow through the waves, one hears both the promise of arrival and the threat of what that arrival might mean. And in the quiet before a raid, when the oars rested and the men leaned on their knees to watch the dark line of land draw closer, the sea itself must have seemed to hold its breath. The question of where the sea peoples came from is as restless as the waters they crossed. The ancient records give us names: Sheridan, Shekalesh, Peliset, Denian, Checker, but they do not give us clear maps. Instead, we are left with theories, each one a fragment of a larger mosaic, each suggesting a birthplace far from the coasts they later struck. Sardinia, Sicily, the Aegean Islands, the coasts of Anatolia, perhaps even lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. the possibilities stretch like a scatter of islands in a misted sea. Some scholars see in the Sheridan a link to Sardinia, pointing to similarities between the horned helmets shown in Egyptian reliefs and carvings found on the island. Others trace the Shekelesh to Sicily, noting echoes in weapon forms and certain pottery shapes. The Denian, mentioned in Egyptian sources, bear a name reminiscent of the Danans of Greek legend, while the Peliset are often linked to the Philistines, who would later settle along the southern coast of Canaan. None of these connections are certain. Each is a shadow on the water, a reflection that shifts as we draw nearer. Theories of their movement often begin with necessity. The late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE were times of instability across the Mediterranean. Drought gripped some regions, reducing harvests and forcing communities to look elsewhere for food. Earthquakes rattled coastal cities, breaking harbours and damaging the ships that sustained them. Political upheavals in larger kingdoms may have displaced entire groups, driving warriors, artisans and farmers alike into exile. In this reading, the Sea Peoples were not born as conquerors, but became so out of desperation, their migrations hardened by the need to survive. Others imagine a more opportunistic origin. With great empires weakening, the sea offered both escape and promise. Disbanded soldiers, disaffected vassals, and ambitious chieftains might have joined forces, drawn together by the lure of rich ports and undefended trade routes. In this view, the Sea Peoples were less a single migrating nation and more a confederation of shifting alliances, a tide of many currents, united only by the direction they were moving. Material evidence supports the idea of diversity. Pottery associated with the Sea Peoples shows influences from the Aegean, Cyprus, and the central Mediterranean. Their weapons too suggest multiple origins. Long, slashing swords like those of the Mycenaeans, smaller curved blades more common in Anatolia, and distinctive round shields that might have been native to the islands. Even their ships, as depicted in Egyptian reliefs, seem to be a blend of design elements, as if they were built in many different harbours, but sailed under the same purpose. If the Sea Peoples were indeed a coalition, their origins may have been as much about shared experience as shared homeland. Imagine the gatherings in sheltered coves, ships drawn up side by side, fires burning on the beach, leaders speaking in a patchwork of tongues but agreeing on a course. Around those fires sat men and women from islands and coasts scattered across the Mediterranean, bound together by the memory of places left behind and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. And yet, the mystery endures because no single theory fits all the fragments. For every archaeological clue that seems to anchor a group to a specific place, another appears to contradict it. It may be that trying to draw one map for the Sea Peoples is to misunderstand them entirely. They were not a people in the narrow sense, but a movement, a migration of many peoples, some fleeing, some seeking, some conquering, their identities as fluid as the waters they sailed. In the end, the question of their origin is also a question of identity. Did they see themselves as one, or were they always a collection of separate tribes, momentarily bound by circumstance? Perhaps the truth lies in both, that they were many and they were one, in the way that a fleet is many ships moving together across the same sea. What we can say is that the Sea Peoples came from everywhere the Mediterranean touched, and perhaps from beyond its horizon. Their birthplaces were scattered, but their destiny converged in the fires of Ugarit, the battles of the Nile Delta, and the reshaping of the age. The shorelines they left behind may never be known with certainty, but the waves of their passage still lap at the edges of history, carrying hints of many beginnings woven into one tide. They are absent from the inscriptions and the temple reliefs. The records of kings do not name them, and the clay tablets that speak of war, famine and treaties rarely pause to mention their small frightened faces. Yet behind every fleet of the Sea Peoples, behind every burning city of the late Bronze Age, there were children, silent witnesses to the unmaking of their world. Some were born in cities like Ugarit or Pylos, knowing the comfort of familiar streets and the rhythm of market days. They saw those streets turn to ash, the market stalls overturned, the air filled with the roar of fire and the crack of collapsing beams. Their parents carried them through smoke toward the gates, toward the hope of escape, while behind them the only home they had known disappeared into shadow. For such children, memory became a haunted thing, a mixture of warmth and loss, where every thought of home was edged with the sound of running feet. Others were born to the sea peoples themselves, raised on the decks of narrow ships, or in the camps strung along foreign shores. Their world was always moving, the hiss of oars, the creak of ropes, the smell of salt and pitch. They played among coils of rope and baskets of provisions, their laughter mingling with the calls of gulls overhead. They knew no single homeland, only the community of the ship or the shifting settlements along the coasts where their people paused to rest and trade. For them, the sea was not a barrier, but a constant companion, a road that led everywhere and nowhere. The children of conquered lands and the children of the invaders sometimes met, though not as equals. In captured towns, the victors' children might take the empty houses of those who had fled, playing in courtyards, still warm from their former owners' hearths. In other cases, children from both sides found themselves together in refugee camps or mixed communities, where necessity forced a kind of uneasy coexistence. Language barriers dissolved quickly for the young, who learned each other's words with ease, their games crossing lines that their parents could not. Survival for these children was not a matter of heroics, but of endurance. They learned to sleep through the creak of ships in rough seas, to eat sparingly when supplies ran low, to run for cover when the alarm was sounded. They carried the weight of absence, fathers lost in battle, mothers taken ill on the road, siblings left behind in the chaos of flight, and yet, even in the hardest years, they found ways to play, to laugh, to dream. A piece of driftwood became a toy boat, a shell strung on a cord became a treasure. As they grew, the events of their childhood shaped the world they built. Some would settle in the new cities that rose after the collapse, bringing with them the skills and memories of two worlds. Others would follow the sea still, their own children growing up as they had, between one shore and another, carrying seeds of a homeland they had never seen. Their stories, if told at all, would be absorbed into the myths of their people, tales of great journeys, of lost lands, of survival against the odds. Archaeology finds only faint traces of them, a child's grave lined with small shells, a miniature vessel buried beside an adult, perhaps a parent in a mass grave from a destroyed settlement. These fragments are quiet, but they remind us that the collapse of the Bronze Age was not just a matter of kings and battles. It was lived in the smallest details. A hand clutched tightly in fear, i.e., lullabies sung in a language that would soon vanish, the first steps taken on soil far from where a child was born. The children of the Bronze Age collapse carried the shadows of the generation before, but they also carried its resilience. In them, the losses of an age were transformed into the beginnings of another. Their lives were the bridge between a world of palaces, trade, and sprawling empires and the smaller, humbler, but enduring societies that followed. History may not name them, but without their survival, there would have been no future to inherit the ruins. If you listen closely, the Bronze Age is still with us. It lives in the words we speak, in echoes of ancient tongues carried forward through countless generations, reshaped but still recognizable if you follow their roots deep enough. It lingers in our myths, stories of wandering heroes, of cities laid low by fire and fate, of peoples cast adrift upon the sea, and it moves in our very blood, in the genetic threads that link us to those who walked the streets of Mycenae, rowed the narrow ships of the sea peoples, or planted the first fields in the lands where they finally came to rest. The collapse was not a disappearance, but a transformation, the turning of one immense page in the book of humanity. The empires of the late Bronze Age are gone, their palaces reduced to rubble, their scripts silenced for centuries. Yet their influence endures, woven into the foundations of the cultures that followed. The Philistines, born from the migrations of the Sea Peoples, left their mark on the history and traditions of the Levant. In Greece, the descendants of Mycenaean survivors preserved fragments of their past in oral epics that would one day be written down as the Iliad and the Odyssey. Even in Egypt, diminished though it was, the memory of repelling the northern invaders became part of the kingdom's enduring self-image. In our myths, the collapse resonates as a time of both tragedy and rebirth. The ancient stories speak of floods, of cities swallowed by the earth, of gods who tested mortals with hardship. Some of these tales may carry the faint reflection of the droughts, earthquakes, and wars that ended the Bronze Age. Others are reimaginings, the human mind's way of giving meaning to upheaval, turning chaos into a narrative that could be retold by firelight and passed to the next generation. The heroes and wanderers of legend may be the cultural shadows of real refugees and warriors whose names are lost to history. Our DNA holds quieter records. Genetic studies trace movements across the Mediterranean in this era, markers from the Aegean appearing in the Levant, Levantine lineages showing up in Sardinia and Sicily. These are the biological imprints of journeys we know only dimly from archaeology and fragmentary texts. The collapse scattered people like seeds, and some of those seeds took root far from their place of origin, shaping the identities of populations for millennia to come. The Sea Peoples themselves, elusive, many-rooted, half-real in the historical record, may have been both destroyers and bearers of change. In breaking the networks of the Bronze Age, they and the forces that moved alongside them cleared the way for something new. The Iron Age that followed was less centralized, more local in its power, but it fostered new forms of governance, trade, and culture. The great kingdoms that arose centuries later, Assyria, Greece, Rome, would inherit a Mediterranean forever, altered by the end of the Bronze Age. Perhaps this is the deeper truth of that turning. Endings are rarely final. They are thresholds, and though crossing them can mean loss, it also means the beginning of something different. The people who survived the collapse, farmers, traders, warriors, children, carried forward not only their grief, but their skills, their stories, and their will to adapt. Over time, these became the raw material for new societies, each bearing some trace of the age that had come before. When we look back across 3,000 years, the collapse can seem like a distant and impersonal event, the slow crumbling of empires under forces too vast to name. But it was lived in the moment, in choices made under pressure, in acts of courage and desperation, in the daily work of staying alive. The fact that we can speak of it at all is because enough of those choices led to survival, to continuity, to us. And so we close the story not with the image of fire and ruin, but with the quieter image of dawn after the storm. The sea calm again, the air salted and fresh, the silhouettes of survivors gathering on the shore. They are building shelters, lighting fires, planting seeds. They do not know that they have crossed a threshold into a new age. They know only that they are here and that life continues. In the end, perhaps that is the Bronze Age's greatest legacy, that even when the world turned upside down, humanity endured, carrying forward its memory in language, in legend, and in the living blood of its descendants.